What are some of the common myths around meditation in general? What is self inquiry and its relevance to our modern way of living? What are some of the key obstacles to self inquiry? These are some of the questions that we are exploring in this dialogue I am having with Scott Flynn. Scott is also drawn to Advaita or non duality through self inquiry, and he shares his realizations through his website loveoutpouring.com. He also has a book of the same title, Love Outpouring. So let's go into this dialogue.
So, the main thing with any kind of meditation, right, including self inquiry, is there is two views on it from what I noticed, generally speaking. One is that it is seen as some kind of a otherworldly pursuit, a spiritual pursuit, which is somehow divorced from the regular worldly living, which is one extreme. And then the other extreme view I see is that meditation is seen as some kind of a productivity hack where one can use meditation, as it were, to as a means to an end, to be better at what one does. I think both views are having some great blind spots, let's say, in them, because true meditation, especially self inquiry, if you look into it, it's neither something that's completely divorced from our worldly life, but nor is it to be seen as a means to an end, because that makes it just like some kind of an exercise program without looking at the essence of what it is that we are. So, if we really look into self inquiry, what we are basically saying is that the primary ignorance we have is that we are unconscious because we take ourselves to be something that we are not. We identify with thoughts, we identify with opinions, we identify with emotions. And in this false identification, we create a lot of suffering, conflicts, and so on. And when we look into self inquiry or meditation as an activity that is somehow separate from worldly interaction, something to be done in an ashram or in or post retirement or in some mountain cave or whatever ideas people have, then there is a fragmentation in life. We look into meditation as an escape from the worldly interactions, and I think that division is not helpful. On the other hand, if we look at it as a productivity hack, then we are simply continuing with our ignorance of identification with our various avatars, professional or family man or whatever, and we are simply trying to maybe make it slightly less painful or more effective through some practice, and it may have definitely some effect, but the fundamental goal of meditation, true meditation, is to be free of suffering, and that freedom from suffering is not to be realized as long as we don't look into our core false identification with all roles we play. So maybe we can start with this and see how you see this perception of self inquiry or meditation among society in general. Let's take meditation because it's a broader topic, and then we can zoom in on self inquiry and see how people view this and what is the reason why you feel this is very relevant to our day to day living as opposed to the way we just outlined.
Well, to your point, all we know, when I say we, it's the United States and in generally the Western Hemisphere, if we know anything that you just said, it's meditation, where self-inquiry is non-existent. Right? This is the leap that needs to be made eventually if you want to truly experience yourself in a joyful way. We're trained to believe that by making an effort to gain something, it will fill a hole in us. It will fill the sense of lack in which we're satisfied. And if we do that enough times, eventually we will have total fulfillment. That's kind of the overarching um, game plan of society, of success. And as we know, especially as we age, we realize that this is futile. And the message that we're talking about says that if you start with meditation and end up in self-inquiry, and we can talk about the differences of those two, which we probably should, but let me finish my point, that you will experience yourself whole and complete prior to making an effort. And this is totally counterintuitive and unbelievable to a Western mind, that I could be whole and complete and satisfied before I accomplish anything, or before I experience something that has brought me pleasure in the past. Right? Getting a raise, that brought me happiness, right? There is a sense of that. There is success there somehow, and you get a rise. And we all know that rise will wear off, and you're on the pursuit of the next raise, right? And that we know that is samsara, and this is just one of oodles and oodles of examples of samsara. And so when we hear that I can be happy before I get the raise, during the time I have the raise, and even after I have the raise, that I can feel fulfilled. And it's bridging this understanding, like bringing this to light in some soft way that says, no, this is actually reality that we're talking about here. And we've fallen asleep, to your point, we've forgotten ourselves. And in that forgetfulness brings these cycles of suffering, of samsara. And so I think it's understanding what meditation is relative to self-inquiry, creating value around self-inquiry and what that means, so that those who are come fresh into this message have something to grab onto, you could say, right? And this is the counterintuitive part that we all know, that what we're after is non-objective, and it's not an object that the mind can know. But yeah, that's the soft entry that we're trying to describe here, how to bring those over into themselves so they can live a life of peace and happiness regardless of what life is bringing.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that came to me as you were speaking, which are probably good to explore, because what you said is exactly right. That example of deriving fulfillment out of a raise or out of any experience, and therefore having it only as a fleeting experience and then waiting for the next high, is essentially the experience or the felt reality of most humans. And it's probably more pronounced in the West, as you said. But I would also argue that now in the East as well, it's become more and more a pursuit of a Western way of living, which is affected even the thinking process, and so on. So one thing that we have to then look into is the role that time plays here, right? So when we look into any fulfillment, we are always looking at fulfillment as an event in time. So this is a good example, a race, or for that matter, looking forward to a vacation and looking forward to any particular event. What happens is we are then making our present activity as simply something to drudge through in order to get that payoff at some point in the future. And that's why our normal state is one of dissatisfaction, anticipation, anxiety, worry, and so on. And there are momentary, fleeting glimpses of fulfillment which goes away, right? So the one way in which perhaps people can relate to it is that when you are functioning in this way, what you are basically doing is you are always functioning in a dissatisfied way, and you are not fully therefore present in the activities that are happening in this moment. You are looking at every moment as a means to some future end in time. And then the irony is one makes meditation also, as I sort of said in the beginning, into another activity that is towards a future end. So I can be more productive, or I can be more effective, or it's not something that I do for the fulfillment of this moment, but as a goal to be realized later. And when we basically live in this time constructed reality, so we, as we know clearly, time is chronologically real, there is yesterday and tomorrow, but within the inner realm, there is only this moment. So every moment I can only function either by giving full attention and accepting the reality of this moment, or I can take my attention away through some future projection into some event yet to happen, or through some past projection into what has already happened. And in a very practical way, we notice that this is the normal state of functioning of most humans. They're either worried about something that's already happened or anxious about something that's yet to happen. And when we talk of self-inquiry, now coming to self-inquiry, what we are basically saying is that this idea of a self that is projected through time is something that is only a fiction created by the mind. And we have to look into this carefully, because when we look at any identification we have with the physical body itself, or with some thoughts, or with a role like a job, or even a family position, all of these things are constantly changing, and there is always flux in them. They come and go, but there is an underlying sense of beingness which doesn't change regardless of what thought is currently active, what role I am performing right now, what state my physical body is in. Regardless of all that, there is an underlying state of beingness. And the beingness is not something I have to do anything to even acquire. It is there as the underlying substrate upon which all activities take place. So when we recognize that this underlying beingness is my reality, my true identity, then what happens is an automatic sense of I don't need to do anything to become full, because this being is always full. And all the activities of becoming then fall in the right place. I can still exercise to keep the body healthy. I can still work hard in my job. I can still take care of my family. while recognizing that all of these activities are all coming and going in the substrate of our true being, which is the true being of everyone around us. And therefore, we don't either judge ourselves or judge others. And there is a true connection of love as well with family or with co-workers or with the world at large, as opposed to a relationship based on attachment and based on what I can get out of it, or based on fear of what I would lose. So when we look into self-inquiry in this way, we can see that being fulfilled, as you said, now, before even you make any effort, is something that has to be appealing to anyone who wants to live life free of suffering. And so that's where we should look into this and see, why is it that this is not something that the modern mind is looking into? What is the reason why this doesn't have the intuitive appeal?
I'm going to make the argument that it's because no matter where we look in our society, education, religion, any social fabric that we're involved with, this message is absent. So it's by no fault of our own that we are so asleep. Right? At the moment you point this out to somebody utilizing their own experience. And we've all had this experience of, like, when we reflect back in our younger days, in our teens, 20s, 30s, and so on, we always get this sense that I've always been me. There's something here that's never changed, ever. And we know that. We reflect back, and our bodies change, our relationships change, our finances change, everything changes. Yet there's something here within me that has never changed. And the moment we experience that, what do? It's so alluring, because it's peace and joy, that what do? We turn our mind to it to try to know it. And the moment we do that, it vanishes. And so utilizing our direct experiences like that and saying that place is real, that's reality. Are you open to exploring that more? Because this message is saying that is everything that you're after, right? We know that. Those of us who are practicing and have experienced it directly, it's this simple, and it is everything we're after. And so are you open to analyzing it? And then, some people are going to say no, and some people are going to say yes. And then you would say, well, here are some bridging techniques to be able to bring you into that experience a little bit more at a time, until eventually, through self-inquiry, that just becomes your everyday presence. It's the presence of being. So to your point, it's no fault of our own that society's like this. It's just unheard of, and it's unbelievable at first. This can't be the truth. Consciousness, awareness, it can't have these values. It's something that scientists talk about in universities. It doesn't mean anything, but it's everything. And helping those back into themselves is the underlying solution to suffering, right? Where the samsara dies down and permanence arises. That's what remains, is the permanence of being, which you point to.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think what you hit upon there, the education and the great missing aspect of education. At the root of all of this is, I think, a very important point that you brought out, because education not only does not expose us to our underlying being, but it goes the other way and always exposes the feeling of lack, the need to derive satisfaction out of becoming. So, one of the ways in which education works in the modern society, and this is the paradigm that is used across the world now, it may have originated in the West, but it's taken over. But now I'm seeing some interesting experiments in some countries, both in Europe and in the East, where they are trying to step out of this to some extent. Because if you look at education, the first thing that education does is it instills a sense of comparison, right? Whether it's grading, whether it's competitions, whether it's evaluating one, it's always in the sense of emphasizing that you have to measure yourself against your peers in order to realize your worth. And you are put in a stack rank, as it were. And that stack rank is exactly what corporations do. So people do not ever grow out of this comparison mentality, because that's so ingrained through education to look into this. And then the other related problem is that we are using some arbitrary metric to measure all the children, and then instilling in them that you have to measure up against these yardsticks in order to be considered worthy. So if we look at self-inquiry, if we really look into the nature of our being, we recognize that we are all endowed, each with unique bodies, first of all, unique thought structures, unique intellectual capacities, unique skills, talents, all of this. So everybody is unique and different. The only thing that's common across every being is the sense of beingness itself. It's the fact that we, as you said earlier, whether in your teens or 20s or 30s or whatever age you are in, whatever position you are in, there is a sense of beingness, quiet presence, the feeling I am, which is prior to taking on any identification or any content. So our entire educational system is focused on the content. Content has a role to play, but it is important to first point out that content is only for functional purposes, and one can, of course, optimize one's skills and talents and knowledge and all of that. But if one is, first of all, children especially are allowed to flower in their uniqueness, as opposed to be measured against a common yardstick. And secondly, and most importantly, to point to the fact that regardless of how uniquely different they are, underlying all of that is the sense of presence, which has no difference, no content, and it is ever fulfilled. It doesn't look for anything to be added, and it is ever present. I think this is a gaping hole in education, and certainly I think that's a very important point. The other thing that comes to me from a practical standpoint is, when we talk to people about it, the way in which, for example, the Buddha spoke is very beautiful, because he said, the first thing he said is, suffering is real. So instead of even talking about self-inquiry or what is the nature of the self, because everyone wants to look into their life and see what it means to me. So the first thing, if you are awake, is to recognize that there is suffering through comparison, suffering through anger, suffering through greed, suffering through wanting things one doesn't have, so many factors. And if we point out the fact that suffering is entirely, we're not talking of physical pain, of course, we're talking of mental suffering, is entirely due to activities of this false egoic identification. And if we look into the nature of this false ego and question if it's real, then it falls off, and what remains is the being which is ever free of suffering. So I feel that perhaps these are two different points. One is about education, which is important, but the other is when we are talking to adults, when we are talking to people who are looking into this, perhaps suffering is the entry point to talk about why this is relevant.
Yes. I want to go back and pick up some loose ends in our discussion. I think we need to make it clear that we're not suggesting that getting raises or going on vacation or any of these high points in our life are wrong or negative in any way. That's not what we're saying. If you viewed the high points, if there's high points and there's low points, right? So if you got the raise and then there's time, then you go on vacation, there's a high point, there's another dip, and there's an adventure of somehow. What this is saying is that the problem arises in between the high points, right? That the seeking and the sense of lack is down here in the troughs. What this is saying is that we're raising the troughs up to the high points so that everything is experienced in a permanent way and not fluctuating states of mind, right? So happiness is a way, and suffering is a state, are states of mind that come and go. So yeah, those that watch this, I think we need to make it clear that this is a celebration of life, right? You're picking up the troughs of denial and raising them up to where everything's a celebration.
Yeah, that's maybe another way to put it is that we are unaffected regardless. So let's see how to phrase it best. When there is a sense of calmness, even in a high, there is a totally different way that high is experienced from when the high carries you away, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what maybe we are talking about when we say that we are in the same high regardless of what comes and goes. Because there is two different types of highs, if you will. One is the high that is a product of events, and it will inevitably come and go. It's essentially, if you look into neuroscience, I was looking into this recently, watching a couple of good podcasts on it, and it talks about the role dopamine plays in all these kinds of high situations. And in fact, the social media companies, for example, know quite well how dopamine works, and they use it to optimize. For instance, they have found that every time you get a simple like on your message, your dopamine gets a hit. So there are brain states that get triggered through chemical processes which result in a high. It's no different from eating a piece of chocolate. It's literally and exactly the same chemical that's released when you eat a chocolate, or when you watch something exciting, or when you get a raise, or when you are flattered by someone. Literally, every single external stimulus results in the same chemical process that gives you a feeling of high. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that neuroscience points out is that this dopamine high will always inevitably crash because the body cannot sustain this chemical state of being high in dopamine for a long period of time. It's not possible. So naturally, it has its own ebbs and flows. Now, if we tie ourselves to these ebbs and flows, as we pointed out, then we are looking for these highs and we are identified with the highs, taking ourselves to be the one having the high instead of being the awareness in which it takes place. And therefore, we are also taken down by the same wave when it crashes. And on a different related note, this is why the ancient wisdom is validated by neuroscience now, that it is important to work hard to get any high as opposed to instant gratification, because the faster it goes up, the faster it comes down, is basically what science says. So if you work really hard towards a goal and you reach a high, it actually has a much slower down curve as opposed to getting an instant gratification of taking a drug for some sense. But regardless, in either case, it has an inevitable high and low. But what we are pointing to is, regardless of the movement of chemicals in the brain that causes these highs and lows, there is a space in which these activities happen, including these chemical activities that respond to external stimuli. And that space is the entire space of our brain, which is essentially simply a state of pure awareness. And it is in awareness that these activities happen. And when awareness, which is always calm, which is simply present to these highs and lows, becomes our natural grounding, then these movements do not affect us. We remain in a calm high, if we can use the word high, which is independent of this coming and going. And that calmness is true celebration of life, because that is life itself. It is life itself is a happening in this ground of awareness and peace. And when peace is our ground, then there is complete acceptance of all the highs and lows, a complete acceptance of all the people corresponding to that, a complete lack of judgment, and a true love for all that comes and goes. And perhaps therein lies true celebration of life, in this peaceful beingness.
Yes, absolutely. You know, in my example, I guess what I was saying to my highs were, it's when in your highs, there's the absence of desire, right? Your desire's fulfilled. And we know desirelessness means happiness. That's when we experience happiness. So yeah, it's the permanence of being in which the absence of desire is there, and therefore fulfillment is experienced, is what we're really quote unquote after. And that is the permanence of being. So if you know yourself as yourself directly, then that is the definition of the absence of desire and the experience of fulfillment. But you're right, this permanence goes along, and you could say that life is cycling, but it's impermanence, I guess is to be a better way, right? Your experience being is in its permanence, and within that, the cycles of so-called life are happening. And but you're experiencing them from a realm of permanence. So yes, there's many ways to structure what you and I are trying to.
It's exactly. It's just a question of finally all words are only pointers, as we know.
Yeah.
So we are only pointing to the fact that there is this beingness which is always in peace and desireless and happy.
Yeah, it's not a chemical high, to your point, right? It's not that extreme. Maybe there's chemical, maybe, but you're not. It's not. But it's a level dose. If anything, you could look at it like that. It's just levelness.
Yes.
It's and to your education point, I think this is a wonderful subject, because the gap that you're describing, again, it goes back to having talents, cultivating those talents. There's nothing wrong with that. Learning, nothing's wrong with this at all. Like, this is, again, back to like the celebration of life and the manifestation. Like, I want to play in this. Where we fall short is that we teach our children to identify ourselves as our talents, as our conceptual knowledge, right? Instead of saying there's theoretically two things going on here. It's not theoretical. That's not true. It's actual reality. The beingness and the manifestation, right? Consciousness, and consciousness is activity, which is the manifestation. And cultivate your talents. Cultivate talents would be the better way to say it. Cultivate conceptual knowledge. Cultivate how you can help in society, but you don't identify yourself as these talents and education and anything else that you decide to engage into, right? I mean, the true suffering is when we leave ourselves and we turn our attention onto what is not ourself, but we believe it to be ourself. And so that's the real education. You stay at home and here where the peace is, contentness is, and you just let life take you where it takes you, right? I mean, to your point, the education system is what starts to generate our initial suffering when we identify as our careers and everything else, as a parent, as a friend, as an athlete, as a musician, as an artist,
Yeah, exactly. I think the education system plays a great role in this core delusion we have, especially in this modern world. And the amazing thing here is that, see, we are coming to a point where, as a civilization, we are hitting a lot of boundaries of what we can do, right? Because we are not anymore living, even 100 years back, the way we lived was so different. We are so connected now. We are hitting against so many climate boundaries. We are hitting against, AI is taking away the role of so many things that we invested in as human specialities, not just mechanical activities, but even so-called creative activities like writing poetry and doing paintings, and so many other activities are now done by machines more beautifully than most humans. Our rate of consumption is not on a sustainable path with the number of people on the planet, and we are hitting against resource boundaries of water. So when we look into this core delusion we talked about of taking ourselves to be this individual and looking for fulfillment, what we are recognizing is we are living in a world now where this is not even going to be a choice soon. Because if everyone takes oneself to be an individual and wants to live maximizing their consumption in order to attain fulfillment, we're living in a finite planet with finite resources. with 8 billion people, we are going to soon face massive calamities of different nature. We are already starting to see them. When we are investing our sense of self in our work, and then machines come and take over all that work, we are filled with a great inner vacuum where we don't know who we are if we are not our work. Then there is also the whole threat of war always looming on us because of people taking on religious identities and national identities and then causing terrorism and wars and so on. So when we are talking of self-inquiry, one of the things that's very interesting today especially is that it is, I would argue, the most relevant knowledge at a practical level to human civilization. Because if we don't have a significant change in trajectory, and this can happen only if enough serious leaders in various fields, if we are not necessarily talking of 8 billion people doing self-inquiry, that's never practical, but leaders who are leading fields of education, economics, politics, science, technology, if people who are leading these fields are themselves caught in a wrong identification with the self as the ego, and therefore caught in divisive boundaries, identifications, then we are inexorably going towards more and more civilizational calamities. So I think this is something that is important to be aware of, is that it perhaps has come to a point where it's not even a luxury or something that one can look into only because of one's philosophical inclination or spiritual inclination, but it's I would say a civilizational need, because if we don't go into this wisdom and if we continue the current trajectory, while science marches on, technology marches on, consumption rates grow at an exponential rate, we may not have a sustainable future for our children. It may not be even possible. And I think that's something that people should see as a serious message to wake up to.
Yeah, self-inquiry is, in my experience, the only way to experience this world that has apparently is going mad in a sane way. Like this message of non-duality or Advaita, it's brought sanity to this character. And in a world that looks like it's going crazy, this is what we're after. You know, those of us that are seeking, and not even those of us that are seeking, it's just everybody desires a world of harmony. And we look out in the world and it just doesn't seem to be doing that. But this goes right back to our point earlier. When you know yourself, the more and more you know yourself, the more and more when you peer out into the world, you experience it as peace, even though the world is in its massive samsara. And just like you said, this is the pinnacle of how we, whoever that is, the leaders, this is the way out, which is the same way we come in, is by turning within and seeing what the peace and love and wholeness and happiness that's contained within. But yeah, when I talk to people, it's just that, you know, everybody wants it to be better than it is, and this is the paradox, is that by wanting it to be better than it is, you're asking what is to not be what it is. Right? This is where the perplexingness and the paradox comes in, because you can't ask the world to change itself, right? Because that would be resisting. You can only change yourself, which then changes the perspective of how you view the world, which is
Yes.
right. It accomplishes the same thing, because if more of us started doing this, and there was a mass migration into self-inquiry, what we bring to the world is sanity itself, is wholeness, is completeness, and you're bringing it in a form that you're not out here trying to push levers in the world to make it happen. So by turning within and then perceiving it different, you're not resisting what is anymore. You're still allowing this to be what it is. It's just what has changed is how you perceive it. I like to say you perceive the world as you experience yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So if you experience yourself in a state of wholeness and lacklessness and joy, then when you peer out, that's what you'll perceive, even if it's going bonkers out there.
Yes. Yeah, exactly right. The reason things are going bonkers is exactly because of this unconscious nature of humans.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the more, as you rightly said, one's own experience of the world is based on one's experience of oneself. So if you are rooted as the ever fulfilled present awareness, then automatically your activities are peaceful. You are not going to go on any activism of any kind for peace, because your very life will be an expression of peace.
Yeah.
And if we only see this, that we are minimizing suffering, living in peace, and living in harmony. It's interesting, the word disease, for example, in English, if you look at it, it literally means lack of ease.
Yes.
Right? So with the body also physically, it's been proven that most of the diseases are because of psychosomatic reasons. So it's a way of health, harmony, and peace, physically, mentally, emotionally. And when we live in this harmony and peace and ease, what we put out there is also an expression of peace. And I think that's what we need to do. And that is true celebration of life, to use your earlier point, is that when we act out of peace, we can create still technology, we can do artwork, we can engage in business, we can do any realm of living, we can engage in any activity, but the quality of the action will be entirely different from the one who is looking to use the action as a means to fulfillment. So it is instead of using the action to gain fulfillment, we act out of fulfillment and give the action as an expression of love. It's a completely different way to act. And I think that quality of action can come about when this fulfillment within is our felt state of being. So that's essentially what self-inquiry is that it is again, something you alluded to is it is not about denying life at all. It is actually to celebrate life, to only enhance the quality of every activity of life to its best, most creative, most peaceful, most loving expression, rather than escaping from life or walking away from life or anything of that nature. If that's clear, then one would see that this is an intelligent way of living. It is not something that's taking anything away, but it's only adding.
Yes, and I think the critical point here is that an ego can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's what self-inquiry is. It's dissolving the ego. You know, I like to say the ego is out here trying to run this life, and in self-inquiry, you're dissolving the ego and you're coming home to yourself, and you're experiencing life as it manifests, which means that you're in line with reality. You're in line as it manifests, and there's peace in that. There's no room, there's no distance between you and an ego anymore to just sneak in there to screw it up, so to speak. So this happens unintentionally and unavoidably, right? This is just, it just happens. You don't do being just happens.
That's it, yeah.
Right? And I think one of the most impactful pieces of this, back to your point, you're still an artist or an athlete or a businessman, right? If that's what you do, that's what you do. It's how you experience that,
mm-hmm.
and how others view you experiencing that and so-called doing that, mm-hmm. right? Because you're not who you used to be. You've reduced the edges of yourself, so to speak. You're softer. And you don't become just a total lamb, right? There's still a lion. You're still impenetrable if you need to be. It's still there.
Oh, yes. In fact, yeah, definitely. In fact, I would argue that the true lion wakes up only when you recognize yourself, because otherwise you are a lamb because you're always in fear.
That's, yeah.
Right. So when you're truly, even the psychologists say that every fear is basically the fear of death.
Yeah.
Right. So when you are free of the fear of death is when you are truly free of fear. And being free of fear of death is only possible when you are not identified with the body or with activities of the body, but recognize that there is something deeper which never is born, never dies, which is our true nature. And that's when we are fearless, and fearlessness leads to action of a totally different nature. So, yeah.
But it's back to the paradox where you don't build an armor around you to protect yourself, right? The lion doesn't come from an egoic effort to build a thick barrier around you where nobody can get through that barrier, right? What makes you impenetrable is that there's no thing here anymore to hurt or penetrate you, right? This is going back to the paradox of this message, right? Letting go. And somehow in the letting go of what you are not to come home to who you are, you become impenetrable, even though you've emptied yourself.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I mean, the very useful metaphor or example one can give is, which can be easily relatable, is if you take this room I'm sitting in or you are in, everything in the room can be destroyed except the space in which the room is.
Absolutely.
So when you recognize that what is the essence of this room, when we recognize that the essence of the room is not the table, not the chair, not the light, not all these pictures or all that, but the very space which holds the room. And that space is impenetrable, as you put it, because nobody can take it away. You can destroy the walls of this room, the space is still here.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what we are talking about. Awareness is here, regardless of which object is taken away or not.
Yes. You know, it goes back to a sentence that you and I have discussed in the past. It's really simple. It's Saint Francis of Assisi's, love and do as you will.
That's it. Yeah.
Right? But here we get it backwards. Not here in this conversation, but in general society. We're doers. We do as we will in the hopes to someday love.
Yes.
Right? And this is saying, no. Just flip that around. You'll enjoy this so much more if you first know yourself, the love of yourself, and then go out. Yeah.
That's a beautiful note, yeah. I think we can probably stop with that note, because I think it's a very good note to end, that love is not something to be attained through doing, but love is the state from which doing can happen.
Yes. Being is the new doing, in which there's no doing, there's just being.
There's, exactly.